Another big challenge for the future is population in cities. We've recently come to a world population that's majority in urban settings. Will remote access technologies and increase in mobile support make it kind of tip the other way?
Yeah, there's some evidence that the rate of urbanization is slowing just a tiny little bit. So some of the forecasts for 2050 are now being revised downwards a little bit. But in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty marginal. There's some really interesting stories from around the world where people in rural areas are using different technologies to kind of maintain their lifestyle and build a livelihood without migrating to the city, which is what's driving everybody else to do it, is jobs and income. There's a Dutch anthropologist who studied the Bedouin in the northern part of Mali. These are the traditional Saharan desert nomads, and they now all have mobile phones. And they've altered their historic trade routes to go to hilltops where they know they can get cell phone coverage so they can get the market price for whatever it is that they're herding or collecting. That's pretty fascinating. In the grand scheme of things worldwide, I don't know how big of an impact that's going to have. What I think is that these technologies, mobile technologies, any kind of remote communications, actually accelerates the urbanization process. And I think that's one of the reasons why cities are growing so fast now, is because these technologies, they amplify the benefits of being a city. I mean, if you have a mobile phone, if you have a smartphone in a city, you can get more done. You can be more aware of what's going on in your social network and respond to it more effectively and more efficiently. You can have more interactions with other people that create value. And I think that's where a lot of and the World Bank has done some research that's shown that a certain increase in mobile phone adoption actually leads to, or is correlated with a rise in GDP. We don't know if it causes it, but it certainly happens together. So I think the general forecast that by the end of the century, 90% of the world's population will be urban is probably not something that's going to change significantly.
You've offered criticisms about certain tech companies for basically offering cookie-cutter solutions to problems in different cities. What works somewhere is not necessarily going to work somewhere else. But you've also spoken about organizations like Code for America that have done a good job of transferring solutions to different cities and new locations. What makes certain approaches work that way?
I think it's just being sensitive to the problems that the customer has, and taking a kind of user-centric design approach, which is what an urban designer would take, and some of the more progressive kinds of design approaches in the tech world, versus what an IBM or Cisco tries to do when they go in, which is hammer their solution into your problem, because that's how they make money, is through scale and through reusing. I mean, a lot of the smart cities solutions that were initially being pitched to cities 5, 6, 7 years ago were simply things that had been built over the last 20 years by big tech and engineering companies to solve the problems of Procter & Gamble and UPS and all these global companies. And they were basically saying, well, that worked great running a multinational global corporation. I bet it would work great running a big power grid. And that was true to some degree, but I think they didn't appreciate that governments don't operate like companies. The value systems, the way they make decisions, their ability to finance projects, their ability to decide, their ability to simply buy something, they can't make a decision overnight. It's a long, drawn-out process, in many cases designed to prevent corruption. It's designed to prevent quick decisions. The first crop of companies in the smart city space, they weren't consumer-facing companies, they were enterprise-facing companies. And so they didn't understand how to demonstrate to citizens the value of this stuff so that there could be political support for the mayors to go out and buy it. What's happening now, which is really interesting, is the Intels of the world and the Googles and the Microsofts of the world and all these startups like Uber who really intimately understand what end users want are now trying to figure out what's their stake in smart cities. And they've all, to some degree or another, positioned themselves around that. I think that's when things are going to really take off, because you get a company like Apple trying to figure out like what a city should look like, or what a piece of a city should look like, you're going to get some really bold thinking. And I think people are going to respond to it with megabucks.
You actually outline some things that are potentially going to bring us to a brighter future in your 13 guidelines for new civics. Number 5, you talk about model transparency or transparency in algorithms that are used to assess big data and analyze big data and make it actionable. And of course, data is nothing without interpretation. How might this manifest itself?
Yeah, so a friend of mine is working on something right now that's essentially a GitHub for algorithms. The idea is that you would be able to build analytics tools that other people could see. They could see the code, they could see the data that's going into it, they could essentially copy it and reuse it. You'd be notified about those reuses so you could see. And I think there's a lot of work before that becomes as successful as GitHub has. But the idea, that essentially algorithms are always black boxes. Like there's no culture of making them open except in academia. There's no mechanism to do it openly. In government in particular, I think it's important, that's what I wrote about in the book, is that there's been so much excitement about open data at the city level. City government's publishing data sets online that people can, in machine readable format that people can build apps around. And that's great. It's only a tiny tip of the iceberg of the amount of data the city actually has, much of which they can't release. But what I'm concerned about are the algorithms in the software and what they call decision support systems that are working inside city government. So when the police try to identify hotspots of crime, what is the software doing to the data to deliver the report that they use to make policy? And more often than not, those things are locked up inside licensed software that's contractually prohibited from being exposed. So all the tools that we have to find out what's in government documents, like Freedom of Information Acts, don't apply because the city doesn't own it. The city didn't produce it. So I was really trying to call attention to the fact that this is the code that runs a smart city, and we need to see it, and we need to understand it and scrutinize it in the same way that open source software has been scrutinized. And we've found bugs and we've found malware that's been inserted in there, and it's sort of, I think, a good mechanism for crowdsourcing the monitoring of what governments are doing in the area.
Do you think if we were to make progress in that area, we would need as concerted an effort in educating people in algorithm literacy? Or
yeah, I'm kind of pessimistic about it right now. I mean, there are some books that are coming out of the academic world now that are really starting to shine a light on this stuff. Frank Pasquale's Black Box Society, I think, is probably the best one that's out now. There's another book called Weapons of Math Destruction that's going to be out later this year. And I think people are starting to understand the role that this stuff plays in society. And I think the world is having a hard enough time getting its head around the hype of big data, let alone understanding it for what it is beyond the hype. This is the next step. This is what we do with the big data and the tools that we use to process it. And it's complicated stuff. I mean, we have a copy of a book. It's basically the Encyclopedia of Algorithms. And this is a very daunting book to open. I mean, it's basically every computational algorithm ever published. And that's just the public stuff. That doesn't include all the stuff that's been built at Google and Facebook and all these companies.
The other guideline I wanted to mention is your Graceful Failure, which sounds like a call to action for designers and engineers to protect the end user from paralyzing outages. Have you, in your research, found an organization or a city that's done something clever to combat against it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think New York, there's a lot of thinking about that in the post Superstorm Sandy era. The city's Economic Development Corporation is running a competition right now called RISE, which I know it's some acronym, but it's essentially Resilient Technology Solutions for the city. And they're going to be funding 15 to 20 projects that'll take place mostly in the flood-prone areas of the city. And it's about, making the power grid more resilient. It's about making telecommunication services more resilient. I mean, we lost like 8,000 cell sites went out in the southern part of New York State after Sandy, either because they were flooded, they lost power, their backhaul connections got flooded out, they were blown down by the wind. And it was essentially the 19th century again, in New York. People were running around foot messengers, and that's just not an acceptable state of affairs. And then that has carried over into the Rockefeller Foundation's 100 Resilient Cities program. Being based here, that foundation saw firsthand. And they're funding 100 cities around the world a chief resilience officer position, whose job is going to be to do a whole bunch of things, but many of which I suspect are going to involve heavy investments in both big IoT deployments, but also kind of grassroots ones as well.
Is there a particular piece of advice you'd give to engineers and designers who are looking to make positive contributions to cities?
I think, yeah. I mean, this is another one of the civics points in the book was that they should cross-train themselves. They should learn about cities. I mean, a lot of the people that I have the most interesting conversations about smart cities with are not urbanists. They're not architects. They're not urban planners. They're people who maybe were media artists, or they worked in startups, coding, or they're engineers or computer scientists. And they've taken like this tool set that they've developed and this way of approaching design and brought it to this fascinating, complex new problem. I mean, by the same token, some of the most interesting people I talk to about urban research are physicists and computer scientists they know nothing about traditional kinds of urban research, but they're bringing these amazing tools to bear and new ideas and new theoretical models. And it's learning about cities is fun and it's easy. You can spend a year reading all the great classic works of urbanism and learning about your own city, and you're about as smart as any urban planner at that point, because essentially what urban planners learn is like a little bit of political science, a little bit of sociology, a little bit of physical infrastructure, a little bit of architecture, and they just use that to adapt on the fly to what's every day a very complicated situation. And so I think the other piece I would say would be taking everything that we've learned in human-computer interaction about how people interact with screens and start to add on, well, how do people interact with screens and the surrounding environment? How do people interact with wearables and the interactive environment? How do people as groups, small groups, interact with networked objects? We know very little about that. And I think there'll be some research, I think, going forward about that. But I think there's a real opportunity for people that are building stuff to figure that out now and to share what they've learned with the rest of the world. And I think we're starting to see that in these kind of hardware hacking communities. And
so in your own work, is there a particular hardware platform or software application that you find most valuable?
I've just been so busy, I haven't had a lot of time to play around, but I'm really interested in some of the smart home platforms that are getting deployed in the marketplace, namely because most of them are getting really bad reviews, and I think that's a huge opportunity for kind of tinkerers to go in and say, no, wait, we're going to figure out what the smart home is. Honeywell, don't tell us, or some of the stuff that's coming out of Intel is pretty fascinating. Intel's a big ship, takes a long time to turn, but they've tripled down on Internet of Things now and made it very clear that they're going to seed a huge innovation ecosystem, and they're going to continually push new products at them. So Edison is one of their key platforms that they've deployed, and I think that to me is like a big wake-up call that like huge amounts of silicon are going to show up at the edges of networks, and people are going to do really crazy stuff with them. So yeah, I think the stuff that's been put out to date is like the first wave, and then now like the industrial wave is coming, and it's going to be really interesting.
Is there an IoT application, conceptual or realized, that you think has the potential to make a really positive impact on the future?
I'm really interested right now in like citizen sensing of cities, and there've been a number of projects around the world that have basically tried to build kind of Arduino connected devices to measure, air quality and noise and things like that. And I think those kinds of data are going to allow people to mobilize all kinds of campaigns, against polluters, against noise, crime, tainted food, whatever it is. There's been a lot of talk in the kind of pedestrian and biking activist community in New York about how we can start measuring and tracking speeders as part of the Vision Zero campaign, and just some really interesting ideas about, we'll put iPhone cameras in windows and do machine vision and identify the speeders. Maybe go one step further and read the license plate. Maybe lay something down, on the street to measure the speed. And like that's where I think things start to get really interesting. Is we've got all the technical capabilities out there now. Like a lot of the gaps that used to exist are getting closed. Like the kind of connective tissue that Tembo's building, like that's in place now. One of the other things that the New York City's Economic Development Corporation is doing is, I think the next round of their Big Apps contest, which they do every year. It's like we'll throw out a bunch of data and go build some interesting things and help people live better. There's talk that the next version of that is going to be an IoT design contest. So we'll get to see some very specific problems that people are then asked to build solutions for. And like that's when you start to see all the pieces come together. I like to say that like smart cities are the crucible for the Internet of Things, because it's sort of like a neutron star where you've got the problem havers, the cities, the businesses, the citizens. You've got the problem solvers, right? So like all the people that are working in web shops or app shops now, or graduate students who want to go out and build real stuff. You've got the legacy infrastructure that supports a lot of this stuff. So, in Chicago, they're putting air quality sensors on all the light poles in the loop, right? That light pole was a really important piece of legacy infrastructure. And then you've got the new infrastructure, which is all the digital networks, the 4Gs, the Wi-Fi hotspots and stuff. So cities is where all that's coming together, and people are using it to build new stuff. It's not happening in Mountain View. It's not happening in Cupertino. It's happening in San Francisco, in New York City, in London. And it's for that reason, I think, because you just got this real rich substrate on which to build connected ecosystems that are really valuable to people.
I'm looking forward to a smart New York City. Thanks so much, Anthony, for speaking with us today. It's been a great conversation, and thanks to all of our viewers for tuning in to Deconstructing IoT, and see you next week.